I stood at the front of the church, my hands locked tightly around the photo of my husband, Mark Cross. His smile stared back at me from the frame, a smile I thought I knew better than anything in this world. The air inside the church was heavy, thick with the weight of grief and unspoken questions. Friends and family filled the pews, some weeping openly, others just sitting there, stunned. I kept my eyes low, focusing on the polished wood of the casket, willing myself to get through the next few hours without falling apart. My daughter, Sophie, squeezed my hand. I looked down at her and forced a small, broken smile. She was only 14, too young to have to bury her father, too young to know how complicated love and loyalty could become. I told myself I could do this for her, that I had to stay strong because there was no other choice. Then the church doors slammed open with a sharp crack, and the sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Every head turned toward the entrance. My breath caught in my throat when I saw them, 3 strangers standing there like they belonged. A woman about my age with dark, piercing eyes. A boy, maybe 12, shuffling nervously behind her. A little girl clutching a battered teddy bear, her face wide and fearful. The woman walked with slow, deliberate steps down the aisle. Her black dress clung to her like armor. Her eyes never left the casket. She didn't glance at me, didn't acknowledge the whispers and stares that rippled through the crowd like wildfire. She walked straight to the front, pulled a deep red rose from her bag, and laid it carefully on top of Mark's casket. Then, in a voice just loud enough for the front rows to hear, she said, "Goodbye, love." The entire church seemed to stop breathing. I felt Sophie's hand tighten painfully around mine. She leaned closer, whispering, "Mom, who is that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was spinning, screaming for some logical explanation, some way to make sense of what was happening. I could hear Margot, Mark's mother, hissing behind me, "Who the hell are they? What is this circus?" But I said nothing. I kept my face calm, even though my heart was threatening to tear itself apart inside my chest. I stared at the woman, and something inside me knew. I knew before she opened her mouth again. I knew before the boy called out, "Dad," in a broken, trembling voice. Mark had lied to me. He had lied to everyone. I could feel the questions pounding against the walls of my mind, demanding answers I wasn't sure I wanted. How long had this been going on? Who was she? Did he love her? Did he love them? Did he love me at all? Whispers erupted like a storm among the mourners. People were twisting around in their seats, trying to get a better look. Margot was muttering under her breath, furious, wounded. I could hear phrases like mistress, bastard children, how dare she? The anger and confusion in the room built higher and higher like a wave about to crash. Still, I said nothing. I held Sophie's hand and kept my back straight. If Mark had chosen to build a second life behind my back, if he had chosen lies over truth, I would not let him steal my dignity along with everything else. Not here, not today. I could feel the woman's eyes finally settle on me. For a moment, there was something like regret in her expression, something that flickered and died before I could name it. She turned away, gathered her children close, and sat down in an empty pew near the front, as if she had every right to be there, as if she belonged. The priest shifted uncomfortably at the pulpit, clearing his throat, trying to salvage the ceremony. I heard him murmur something about forgiveness and grace, but his words sounded hollow and far away. Then the lawyer, Mr. Harris, stood up from his seat at the side of the church. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he unfolded a thick piece of paper. He asked for everyone's attention, said that Mark had left specific instructions for something to be read aloud today. I felt every pair of eyes in that room turn toward him, then toward me, then toward the woman and her children. The silence was unbearable, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I was about to find out just how many lies Mark had taken to his grave, and just how much truth was about to rise from it. The morning of the funeral started with rain. It tapped against the windows of my bedroom in a steady rhythm, almost like a warning. I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing the same pajamas I had put on 2 nights before, staring at the dress hanging on the back of the door, black, simple, somber. The kind of dress you never imagine yourself wearing until you have no choice. Sophie was downstairs. I could hear her moving around the kitchen, pretending she was fine, pretending she could carry this weight at 14 years old. She had Mark's resilience, that stubborn need to appear strong even when the world was falling apart. It made my chest ache to hear her humming quietly, trying to push the silence out of the house. I stood up, forcing my body to move even though my mind felt trapped somewhere far away. I took the dress down from the door, slipped it on, and fastened the locket Mark had given me on our 10th anniversary around my neck. I stared at myself in the mirror. My face looked unfamiliar, hollowed out by grief, sharper somehow. I touched my cheek, half expecting it to feel like someone else's skin. Mark had been the center of my world for 16 years. He was everything I thought a husband should be. He was charming, successful, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they were the only person that mattered. I used to watch him talking to strangers at grocery stores or neighbors at block parties, thinking how lucky I was that he chose me. We built a life that looked perfect from the outside. A beautiful home, a bright, kind daughter, a marriage filled with little rituals and inside jokes. There were cracks, of course. Every marriage has them. Nights when he worked too late, moments when I caught him staring at his phone a little too long, business trips that turned into weekend absences. But I told myself we were solid. I told myself that love meant trusting someone even when things did not make sense. My father, John Whitaker, met us at the church. He was a quiet, serious man who had raised me to be strong without ever saying the words. He wore a suit that looked a little too big on him now, his shoulders bowed under the years and the grief. He hugged me tightly when we arrived, holding on just a second longer than necessary. When he let go, he rested his hands on my shoulders and said, "You do what you need to do today, Elena. You owe no one anything." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I was too tired to cry again. There were no tears left. Inside the church, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood. Friends, family, neighbors, co-workers, they all filled the pews, murmuring softly, dabbing their eyes, offering me the kind of sympathetic smiles that felt more like apologies. I spotted Margot, Mark's mother, sitting stiffly near the front, her lips pressed into a thin line. She'd always been critical of me, always convinced that no one would ever be good enough for her only son. Today, though, she said nothing, just nodded at me with a tight, unreadable expression. Sophie held my hand tightly as we walked to the front of the church. Her small fingers were cold and trembling, but she kept her chin lifted, determined not to cry. I was so proud of her in that moment it almost broke me. She was carrying this loss with a bravery I could barely match. The service began. The priest spoke in a low, soothing voice about love, about loss, about faith in the face of devastation. Friends stood up one by one to share memories of Mark, the way he made everyone laugh, the way he always showed up when someone needed help, the way he adored his family. I listened to each story, feeling like they were talking about a stranger. My Mark, the man I loved, had kept secrets so big they were about to tear this day apart. I glanced around the room, feeling that sense of wrongness growing heavier with every passing minute. The church was packed, but I felt utterly alone. No one else seemed to notice the tension twisting inside my chest like a knot pulled too tight. No one else seemed to see the invisible cracks running through the foundation of everything we had built. I leaned down and whispered into Sophie's hair, "We're going to be okay." She nodded but did not look up. The priest invited the lawyer, Mr. Harris, to the front. He moved with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who knew he carried bad news. He cleared his throat, holding a thick envelope in his hands, and asked everyone to remain seated after the service for a reading of Mark's final letter and instructions. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. It was not common to have a reading during the funeral. Whispers stirred like wind through dry leaves. I tightened my grip on Sophie's hand. Whatever Mark had left behind, whatever words he had entrusted to Mr. Harris, they would change everything. I could feel it like a tremor deep inside my bones. And I was right. The service ended in a heavy, aching silence. People stood stretching their stiff legs, murmuring softly to each other as they gathered their things. Some made their way toward me and Sophie, offering hugs or whispered condolences. I smiled weakly, barely hearing them, my mind already turning toward whatever Mark had left waiting for us in that envelope. Mr. Harris cleared his throat again, louder this time. His voice carried across the church, cutting through the noise. "Please, if I could have your attention," he said, lifting the envelope slightly in his hand. "Mark requested that I share a final message and some important instructions with you today in accordance with his last will and testament." The room quieted. People slowly shuffled back into their seats. Some looked confused, others curious. Margot stiffened beside me, clutching her purse so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I could feel the tension vibrating through the air like the warning hum before an earthquake. I sat down with Sophie beside me, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the first few words Mr. Harris spoke. Then the church doors opened again, and everything inside me froze. 3 figures stepped into the church. It was the woman I had seen before, the one with the rose, but now she was flanked more closely by the 2 children. They stood there at the back for a moment, uncertain, then began walking slowly down the aisle. A wave of whispers rose from the pews. Heads turned. People leaned into each other, asking in urgent, hushed tones who they were. Margot let out a sharp, disbelieving gasp. Sophie stiffened beside me. The woman walked to the front and slid into an empty pew across the aisle. She sat tall, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the boy and girl pressed close to her sides. She never looked at me, but I could feel the heat of her presence like a fire burning too close to my skin. Mr. Harris faltered for a second, glancing at me, at her, then back down at the paper he held. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, but I could hear the strain underneath. "In preparing his final wishes," Mr. Harris said, "Mark asked that the truth be revealed today, no matter how painful. He wrote that he could not leave this world without giving those he loved the honesty he owed them. The truth." The word hit me like a blow to the chest. Mr. Harris continued, reading Mark's words. "To my beloved wife, Elena, and to my children, I owe a debt that I can never repay. I made choices that caused deep pain. I tried to live 2 lives, believing somehow I could protect everyone from the consequences. I see now that was a selfish and cowardly mistake." There were gasps. Someone in the back muttered something sharp and ugly. Margot rose halfway out of her seat before sitting back down heavily, her face pale and stunned. My hands shook, but I gripped the edge of the pew to steady myself. I would not fall apart. I would not give them the satisfaction. Mark's words continued. "I had another family, Dana Monroe, Liam, Ava. I love them too. I betrayed them too. There is no excuse. There is no justification." I stared at the woman across from me, Dana, and now the pieces started to fit together. The late nights, the business trips, the evasions. They were not random. They were not innocent. He had been living another life just a few miles away from ours. The church felt like it was shrinking, pressing in on all sides. I could barely breathe, but I refused to move. Sophie clung to my arm, her face buried against my shoulder. I kissed the top of her head, trying to ground both of us, trying to keep her from hearing every cruel word being whispered around us. Mr. Harris read the last part of the letter. "I know I do not deserve forgiveness. I know the damage I have caused cannot be undone. But I ask that, in the spirit of love I tried so poorly to honor, you find a way forward." People were openly staring now, turning to look at Dana, then at me. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion or a whispered rumor. It was a living, breathing thing, sitting between us all, impossible to ignore. Margot stood suddenly, her voice shaking with fury. "This is a lie. That woman is a liar. My son was a good man. He would never—" Her words broke off into a choking sob. She collapsed back into the pew, pulling a tissue from her purse and dabbing furiously at her eyes. I stayed silent. I would not scream. I would not run. If Mark had taught me anything, it was that pretending everything was fine did not make it so. I looked around at the faces of people I had known for years. Some looked at me with pity. Some looked at me with judgment. Some just looked away, as if ashamed to have witnessed something so raw. Mr. Harris closed the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it back into the envelope. "The distribution of Mark's estate," he said, "will be addressed now." I straightened my back, wiped my palms discreetly against my dress, and prepared myself. This was not over. Not yet. The real explosion was still coming. As Mr. Harris shuffled the papers in his hand, the church seemed to hold its breath. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, waiting to see what I would do, waiting for me to break. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my heart hammering against my ribs. Margot hissed beside me, her voice low but vicious. "You cannot let this stand, Elena. You need to speak up. You need to fight for Mark's legacy." I did not answer her. I did not even look at her. There was a time when I might have believed that fighting would save something, that clinging to anger would give me back what I lost. But not anymore. Anger could not rebuild trust. Screaming would not stitch my heart back together. Nothing could. Mr. Harris cleared his throat and began reading from the legal documents. Mark Cross designated a single heir for his entire estate, his properties, his businesses, his investments. His decision was not made lightly. He included a personal statement explaining his choice. The room shifted. People leaned forward. The tension thickened. Dana Monroe sat stiffly across the aisle, her jaw clenched so tight that her face looked carved from stone. Her son Liam looked down at his shoes, his small shoulders shaking. Ava buried her face into her mother's side. I watched them out of the corner of my eye. A part of me, the part that had once been capable of unlimited compassion, ached for those children. They were not responsible for Mark's lies. They had lost a father, too, even if their existence had shattered the life I thought I knew. Mr. Harris continued. Mark's will states, "I leave everything to the woman who knew the truth, who carried the weight of my betrayal without rage, without violence, and without destroying the lives around her. I leave everything to the woman who knew," and said nothing. The air rushed out of the room like a tide pulling away from shore. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then slowly, people began turning to look at me. Some faces were shocked, some were angry, and some wore an expression I could not quite name, something close to awe. Margot clutched my arm, nails digging into my skin. "You knew?" she demanded in a furious whisper. "You knew about this, and you said nothing." I turned to her, met her furious gaze with a calm I had fought hard to find, and said quietly, "I knew enough." She recoiled like I had slapped her. Dana stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her face was burning with rage. She pointed at Mr. Harris, her voice shaking. "This is not right. He promised us he would make it right. This was supposed to be ours, too." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment she looked more heartbroken than angry. Mr. Harris simply nodded once, solemn and unmoving. These were his legally binding wishes. The estate belongs to Elena Cross. Dana let out a bitter, broken laugh, scooping Ava into her arms and dragging Liam by the hand. She stormed out of the church, her heels clicking sharply against the floor with every furious step. The doors slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed through the church, a final punctuation mark to a chapter none of us wanted to read. I stayed where I was, breathing slowly, willing my hands to stop shaking. I did not ask for this ending. I did not want to win a war I never agreed to fight. I had simply made a choice months ago when I discovered Mark's secret. I remembered the night I found out. I had seen the texts, the hotel receipts, the way he changed the subject every time I asked about his trips. I confronted him once. He cried. He begged. He said it was complicated, that he had made mistakes he did not know how to undo. He told me he loved Sophie, that he could not bear to lose us. I made a decision that night. I chose not to tear everything apart. I chose silence, not because I was weak, but because I knew that exposing the truth would destroy Sophie's world even more than mine. I chose peace over pride. I chose dignity over revenge. Now, sitting here in this church, filled with stunned, whispering faces, I realized Mark had known that too. In his final moments, he had finally seen the strength it had taken to stay silent. I squeezed Sophie's hand gently. She looked up at me, confusion and pain written all over her young face. I leaned down and kissed her forehead, feeling the weight of the world settle heavier onto my shoulders, but knowing I could carry it. I had already been carrying it for a long time. Mr. Harris closed the files and quietly stepped away from the pulpit. The priest mumbled a few closing words, but no one was listening. The funeral was over. The facade was shattered. There was nothing left to pretend about. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I nodded once to the priest, once to the few friends who still watched me with wide, uncertain eyes, and turned to walk out of the church into the rain. I did not look back. The rain fell in cold sheets as I stepped out of the church. It soaked through my dress almost immediately, clinging to my skin, but I barely felt it. Around me, people stood in small, scattered groups, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Some stole glances at me. Some avoided looking at me altogether. Sophie stayed close to my side, her hand still wrapped tightly around mine. The funeral home director approached, his expression careful and professional. He asked if I wanted to move inside for the final reading of the will, a more formal session for immediate family and beneficiaries. I nodded once. My voice would not have been steady enough to answer. Inside the smaller meeting room, the air was warmer but no more forgiving. I sat down at the long table, my father beside me, Sophie on my other side. Margot sat stiffly across from me, her arms crossed, her mouth pressed into a hard line. A few of Mark's business partners had come too, men and women who had believed they knew him, who now looked shaken and pale. Dana was not there. She had made her choice when she stormed out of the church. I wondered if she would fight the will later. I would not be surprised, but for now, she was gone. Mr. Harris stood at the head of the table. He unfolded a new set of documents, cleared his throat, and began to read the full terms of Mark's estate. The list was long. 2 businesses, a lake house, 3 investment accounts, stocks, bonds, personal savings, life insurance, vehicles, items from the house that Mark had specifically assigned to Sophie. Every asset was listed in black and white, and every one of them was left to me. There were no conditions, no shares split between households, no secret trusts for Dana's children, only me and Sophie. Mr. Harris paused after finishing the list. He glanced around the room, giving anyone who wished a chance to speak. The silence stretched long and taut. Finally, Margot stood up. Her movements were jerky, furious. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You let him do this," she said, her voice thick with rage. "You let him humiliate us. You let him die thinking he could buy forgiveness. You knew he was betraying our family and you said nothing. How could you?" I stood slowly. I felt Sophie tighten her grip on my hand, but I needed to meet Margot's anger head on. "I did it for Sophie," I said, my voice clear. "I did it because I knew that exposing his lies would not undo them. I did it because I wanted at least one part of her world to stay intact for as long as possible." Margot scoffed, a bitter, ugly sound. "And what about loyalty? What about pride?" I shook my head. Loyalty to what? To a lie? Pride in pretending everything was perfect when it was not? Mark made his choices. I chose to protect my daughter. That is the only loyalty I owe. Margot's face crumpled for a moment under the weight of her own grief. She sat back down heavily, turning her face away. Mr. Harris spoke again, quieter now. "Mark also left a personal letter addressed to you, Mrs. Cross." He handed me an envelope heavy with the final weight of everything Mark had never said aloud. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter inside was short. "Elena," it began, "I know I do not deserve your forgiveness. You deserved more from me than what I gave. You deserved honesty, devotion, a life free from betrayal. You gave me love without conditions. You gave Sophie a home built on kindness. You gave me more chances than I earned. I leave everything to you because you are the strongest person I have ever known. You carried my secrets without letting them poison your soul. You kept our daughter's world intact even when I did not deserve your protection. If there is any justice left, it is that you and Sophie can build a new life without the burden of my failures. Thank you for everything. I am sorry for everything. Love, Mark." I folded the letter carefully, my heart a mixture of sorrow, rage, and something unexpected. Closure. Not the kind that erases pain or rewrites the past, but the kind that lets you finally step forward without dragging chains behind you. I tucked the letter into my purse and stood. Sophie stood too, her small face tilted up to me with a kind of fierce, innocent trust that shattered what was left of my anger. "We are done here," I said. Mr. Harris nodded. Margot said nothing. The others murmured polite goodbyes, but their words barely registered. I walked out of the funeral home into the rain once more, Sophie's hand wrapped tightly in mine. This time, the rain felt different. It washed over me, cold and clean. It carried away the last remnants of shame, guilt, and betrayal. It was not forgiveness. It was something stronger. Freedom. The drive home from the funeral was quiet. Sophie stared out the window, her forehead resting against the glass, tracing the raindrops as they slid down. I glanced at her now and then, trying to find words that would make sense of what had happened, but there were none. Some things could not be explained away with soft promises or easy lies. When we pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before us, familiar and foreign at the same time. It was the same house where Mark had kissed me goodnight, the same house where we had celebrated birthdays, Christmas mornings, and lazy Sunday afternoons. It was the same house where I had smiled through dinners, blind to the secret life unfolding in the spaces between. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, the rain pattering softly on the roof. Sophie shifted beside me. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice small but steady. I reached over and tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear. "We are going to be better than okay," I said. "We are going to be honest. We are going to be real." She studied me for a long moment, as if weighing my words, and then she nodded. That small nod felt bigger than anything that had happened that day. It was a beginning. Inside, the house was cold and dark. I switched on the lights, illuminating the neat, carefully arranged world we had built. I wondered how much of it had been real. I wondered if it mattered. Real or not, it was ours now. Sophie disappeared upstairs to change out of her wet clothes. I moved through the house slowly, touching the back of the couch, the frame of a photo on the wall, the edge of the kitchen table, little pieces of a life that had been beautiful and broken all at once. In the living room, I sat down on the couch and opened the letter Mark had left again. I read it a second time, slower this time, letting each word settle in. He had not asked for forgiveness. He had not demanded understanding. He had admitted what he was, a man who had failed the people he loved most. For the first time since I learned the truth, I let myself feel the full weight of it, the anger, the grief, the betrayal. I let the tears come, silent and hot, carving a path down my cheeks. I cried for the life we had lost, for the life we never really had, for the dreams that had turned into ashes. But when the tears finally stopped, I felt lighter. I would never get back the years I spent loving a man who was never entirely mine. I would never erase the pain he had caused, the wounds that still bled beneath the surface. But I could choose what came next. I could choose to rebuild, not around Mark's lies, but around something stronger, around the truth. That night, Sophie and I sat at the kitchen table, eating leftover spaghetti by candlelight, because the storm had knocked out the power. We laughed when the lights flickered back on just as Sophie slurped a long strand of noodles into her mouth, spraying sauce across her shirt. We laughed until we were both breathless and crying again, but this time the tears were different. They were the kind that washed things clean. Later, after Sophie had fallen asleep curled up in my bed, I stood at the window and looked out into the night. The storm had passed. The sky was clear, the stars bright and sharp against the darkness. I thought about Mark. I thought about Dana and her children, about Margot, about everyone who had been caught in the wreckage of his choices. I did not know what the future would hold for them. I barely knew what it would hold for me. But I knew this. I was not broken. I was not defined by the lies someone else told. I was a woman who had faced the truth and survived. I rested my hand on the window pane, feeling the cool glass against my skin, and whispered into the quiet, "We are going to be okay." Not because everything was fixed, not because the hurt had magically disappeared, but because we had chosen not to let it define us. Because in the end, the truth had set us free. And freedom, I realized, was the most powerful thing Mark had ever given me, even if he never meant to. Thank you for listening to my story. If this touched you, if you felt something, or if you've ever faced a moment where you had to choose strength over revenge, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and leave a comment below. I read every one of them, and your stories matter too. And if you want to hear more true stories about resilience, secrets, and the quiet strength that can change everything. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. There's so much more I would love to share with you. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.